think everyone is aware of who these two are. We have a lot of family members here today and a lot of friends who are here in support of Susan and David. I'm going to let them say what they have to say now.
First of all, I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home to us where they belong. Our lives have been torn apart by this tragic event. I can't express how much they are wanting back home, how much we love them, we miss them. They are our hearts. And who I have prayed every day, and there's not 1 minute that goes by that I don't think about these boys. And I have prayed that whoever has them, that the Lord would let him realize that they are missed and loved more than any children in this world. And that whoever has them, I pray every day that you're taking care of them, and know that we will do anything we will to help you to get them home back to us. I just can't express it enough that we just got to get them home. That's just where they belong, with their mama and daddy. Go ahead.
Have you ever thought that a woman could sob uncontrollably in front of cameras, begging the entire world to help her find her 2 kidnapped children, when she was actually the cold-blooded killer who murdered those innocent kids herself? Susan Smith deceived all of America for 9 long days with the most perfect act in criminal history. What turned a mother into a monster? And what horrifying secret was buried deep at the bottom of that icy lake? Welcome to the Case Files. Today we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of the demonic mother, cold-blooded tragedy at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. In today's episode, we'll explore together one of the most shocking cases in American history, the Susan Smith case. This isn't just a story about a horrific crime, but also a painful lesson about lies, mass psychological manipulation, and the devastating consequences of untreated psychological trauma. Let's peel back each layer of secrets, from fake tears on television to the gruesome truth at the bottom of a deep lake. Part 1. Foundation of Tragedy. A childhood full of trauma. The beginning of an unfortunate life. Susan Lee. Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in the small town of Union, South Carolina. Her family initially seemed normal, with parents Harry and Linda Vaughn and 2 older brothers. But when Susan was only 6 years old, her father committed suicide with a handgun in the garage. This sudden death left deep wounds in the child's soul, making her always feel abandoned and not good enough to be loved. After her husband's death, Linda Vaughn quickly remarried Beverly Russell, a successful businessman and member of the local Republican Party. At first, Russell seemed like the ideal stepfather, wealthy, with social status, and appearing to care about Susan. But when Susan entered adolescence, Russell began systematically sexually abusing her. These behaviors went on for years without anyone in the family knowing. Adolescence full of trauma. Susan grew up as a beautiful, intelligent girl who was loved by many at school. However, inside, she was struggling with serious psychological trauma. At age 13, Susan first attempted suicide by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Luckily discovered in time, she was rushed to the hospital for emergency care. However, no one in the family truly understood the pain Susan was going through. At 16, Susan finally had enough courage to report Russell's abuse. Linda initially kicked Russell out of the house, but after a short time welcomed him back. This made Susan feel betrayed once again. Psychological therapy sessions were started, but Russell continued the abuse in more subtle ways. At 18, Susan became pregnant with an older married man. When this relationship ended, she had to have an abortion and attempted suicide for the second time. This time, she cut her wrists with a razor blade, but was once again saved. All these events created a pattern of self-destructive behavior that would follow Susan throughout her life. A patched-together marriage and false hope. In 1991, Susan met David Smith, a young man working at a local factory. David was gentle and honest, but somewhat weak in character. To Susan, David represented an opportunity to escape her painful past and build the happy family she had never had. They married on March 15, 1991, and shortly after, their first son, Michael, was born. Susan thought that becoming a mother would heal her psychological wounds. Alexander, their second son, was born in August 1993. However, instead of bringing happiness, the role of motherhood created additional pressure for Susan when she realized she couldn't love her children naturally like other mothers. Susan and David's marriage quickly ran into difficulties. David discovered Susan was having affairs with several other men. They constantly argued about money, Susan's wasteful spending, and Linda's excessive interference in their family life. After many breakups and reconciliations, they finally decided to separate in early 1994. Part 2. Fateful Romance. Tom Findlay and the Breakup Letter. The meeting that changed everything. After separating from David, Susan applied for a secretary position at Conso Products Textile Company, one of the largest businesses in Union. The company was owned by the Findlay family, one of the wealthiest and most prestigious families in the region. There, Susan met Tom Findlay, the company president's son, 27 years old, handsome, single, and very wealthy. Tom Findlay was not only handsome, but also educated, polite, and charming. He represented everything Susan had always craved: wealth, social status, and a luxurious lifestyle she had never experienced. To Susan, Tom wasn't just a lover, but an opportunity to completely change her life. Their relationship began in late 1993 and developed quickly. Tom took Susan to lavish parties, expensive restaurants, and introduced her to the local upper class. Susan felt like she was living in a dream. She began imagining a future with Tom, a future where her 2 children would have no place. No warning signs. However, Tom Findlay never truly committed to this relationship. He always avoided when Susan mentioned the future, and never showed interest in Michael and Alexander. In fact, Tom had been very clear about not wanting children and not wanting to be involved with a woman who already had kids. Susan began to feel desperate when she realized her 2 children were becoming the only obstacle preventing her from having the life she wanted. She started having strange thoughts about freeing herself from these constraints. In conversations with friends, Susan often complained about how difficult it was being a single mother, and she wished to be free like other women. The Fateful Letter. On October 17, 1994, just 8 days before the tragedy, Tom Findlay sent Susan a breakup letter. In the letter, he wrote very frankly that he couldn't continue the relationship because Susan had 2 children. Tom explained that he wasn't ready to take responsibility as a stepfather, and he wanted a relationship with a woman who didn't have family burdens. This letter hit Susan like lightning. She realized that Tom Findlay, the man she loved and saw as her only chance to change her life, had abandoned her just because of her 2 children. In Susan's disturbed mind, Michael and Alexander were no longer her children, but obstacles separating her from happiness. After receiving the letter, Susan tried to contact Tom multiple times, but was rejected each time. She even told Tom about being abused by her stepfather, hoping this would make him sympathetic and return to her. But Tom remained firm in his decision. Part 3. The Fateful Night. October 25, 1994. The final hours. October 25, 1994, was an ordinary Tuesday in Union, South Carolina. Susan came home early from work, seeming normal when picking up her 2 children from daycare. No one could imagine what was going through her mind. According to Susan's later confession, she had intended to commit suicide along with her 2 children. In her disturbed mind, she thought that if she couldn't live happily with Tom Findlay, then she didn't want to live anymore. And she didn't want to leave her 2 children orphaned in this world. Around 8 p.m., Susan put Michael and Alexander in her red Mazda Protégé. She carefully fastened seat belts for both children, a detail that would later become important evidence, showing her actions were intentional. Susan then drove to John D. Long Lake, an artificial lake about 5 miles from her home. The moment of crime. At John D. Long Lake, Susan drove down the slope leading to the boat ramp. According to her confession, she initially planned to drive straight into the lake with both children. But at the last moment, survival instinct took over. Susan jumped out of the car before it rolled into the water. She stood on the shore, watching her car slowly sink into the lake in the darkness. According to experts who later recreated the scene, the car took about 6 minutes to completely sink. During those 6 minutes, Michael and Alexander were still alive, trapped in the car as water gradually flooded in. They might have woken up and tried to escape, but being too young and strapped in their seatbelts, they couldn't save themselves. The recreated images showed that as the car sank, water poured in through the vents and windows. The 2 children might have cried out for their mother in their final minutes of life. One of the most heartbreaking details discovered later was the small hand of one child placed on the car window, like a final plea for help. The deception plan activated. After witnessing the car sink into the lake, Susan executed a plan she may have prepared beforehand. She ran about half a mile to the McLeod family's house, people she didn't know. Susan knocked on their door in a panicked state, crying and telling them a fabricated story about kidnapping. According to Susan's initial statement, she had stopped at a red light at the Monarch Mills intersection when a black man about 40 years old, wearing a plaid jacket, dark shirt, jeans, and dark knit cap, opened her car door and got in. He pointed a gun at Susan's side and said, "Shut up and drive." Susan claimed he forced her to drive to a remote area, then pushed her out of the car and drove away with her 2 children. This story seemed believable and convinced many people, including police in the early days of the investigation. Part 4. The Perfect Act. 9 days of lies. The investigation begins. Immediately after receiving Susan Smith's report, Union County Police launched a large-scale investigation. Information about the kidnapping was quickly broadcast throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. A composite sketch of the suspect was created based on Susan's description and widely distributed. The FBI was also called in, making it a federal investigation. Hundreds of police officers and volunteers participated in searching for Michael and Alexander. Forest areas, ponds, lakes, and potential hiding places were all thoroughly searched. Susan Smith becomes America's grieving mother. For 9 days, Susan Smith became the face of parental loss across America. She appeared on most major television networks, from CNN to ABC, from NBC to CBS. Each appearance featured Susan crying uncontrollably, begging the kidnapper to return her children. In an interview with journalist Harry Smith on CBS this morning, Susan said, "I just want to tell whoever has my children that please be good to them. They're just innocent children. Michael is such a good boy, and Alex is so sweet. Please don't hurt my children." David Smith, Susan's ex-husband, also frequently appeared alongside his ex-wife in interviews. Despite their separation, David completely trusted Susan's account and defended her against all suspicions. He said, "Susan is a wonderful mother. She loves her children more than anything in the world. There's no reason to doubt her at all." Community reaction and racial discrimination issues. Susan's description of the kidnapper as a black man created serious social consequences. The African American community in Union and throughout South Carolina felt insulted and outraged. Many innocent black people were stopped and searched by police simply for matching Susan's description. African American community leaders spoke out in protest, arguing that Susan was exploiting racial prejudice to cover up her crime. However, in the tense atmosphere of sympathy for the unfortunate mother, these protests received little public attention. Supporters and doubters. While most American public opinion sympathized with Susan, some people began questioning the authenticity of her story. Journalists and criminal experts noticed several unreasonable details. Why would a kidnapper leave Susan alive and only take the car with 2 children? Usually, carjackers only care about the car, not about children. Why could Susan remember so many details about the kidnapper's appearance in such a stressful situation? Why did no one witness the kidnapping at a fairly busy intersection like Monarch Mills? However, these doubts were mostly expressed in private discussions, not publicly, for fear of being seen as lacking sympathy for the grieving mother. Part 5. Truth Revealed. In-depth investigation. Contradictions in the statement. As the investigation progressed, Union County detectives began discovering serious contradictions in Susan Smith's statement. The biggest inconsistency was about the location where the kidnapping occurred. Susan insisted that she had stopped at a red light at the Monarch Mills intersection when she was kidnapped. However, when police checked the traffic light system at this intersection, they discovered that the light only turned red when there was a car waiting in the cross lane. If, as Susan said, there were no other cars at the intersection, the light could not have turned red for her to stop. Additionally, Susan claimed that before going home, she had gone shopping at a local supermarket around 9 p.m. However, when police checked, no employees at the supermarket remembered seeing Susan and her 2 children that evening. Susan also said she planned to visit a friend, but when police contacted this friend, they said there had been no plans to meet Susan that evening. Polygraph test. On October 27th, both Susan and David Smith were asked to take polygraph tests administered by the FBI. David's results showed he was completely truthful and knew nothing about his children's disappearance. However, Susan's results were completely different. She failed most important questions, especially those about the current location of her 2 children and whether she knew anything about their condition. Although polygraph results cannot be used as evidence in court, they made investigators even more suspicious of Susan. Searching the lakes. When clues on land yielded no results, police decided to expand the search to lakes and streams around Union. John D. Long Lake was among the first locations checked. Initially, divers only searched within 30 feet of the shore, based on experience that cars usually couldn't roll farther than this distance when falling into water. However, after 2 unsuccessful searches, they decided to expand the scope. On November 3rd, during the 3rd search at John D. Long Lake, divers finally discovered Susan's Mazda at a depth of about 18 feet, 122 feet from shore, much farther than initially predicted. The final confrontation. On the same day the car was discovered, investigators invited Susan to the police station to update information about the investigation. In reality, this was the final confrontation. Detectives put Susan in a difficult position by presenting contradictory evidence from her statement. They also announced that the car had been found in the lake, but didn't reveal that they already knew the 2 children were dead. Facing increasing pressure and undeniable evidence, Susan Smith finally broke down. At 5:05 p.m. on November 3rd, 1994, she wrote and signed a handwritten confession, admitting that she had killed her 2 children. Form. Part 6. The Horrific Truth. Body discovery and public reaction. Crime scene examination. After obtaining Susan's confession, divers returned to John D. Long Lake to recover the car. The scene they witnessed brought tears to even experienced professionals in the field. The red Mazda remained intact at the bottom of the lake. Inside the car, Michael and Alexander were still sitting in their car seats, seatbelts securely fastened. A particularly heartbreaking detail was Alexander's tiny hand placed on the window glass, as if the little boy had tried to find a way out in his final moments. Besides the two bodies, police also found Susan's wedding dress and a family photo album in the car. These items showed that Susan might have planned to erase her past to start a new life. Autopsy results. The autopsy report conducted by forensic pathologist Sandra Conradi showed that both Michael and Alexander were alive when the car sank into the water. Both children's cause of death was drowning. This meant the two children experienced their final moments in ultimate despair and terror. According to police simulation, the car took about 6 minutes to completely sink. During this time, water gradually poured into the car through gaps and the ventilation system. Initially, the two children might have been sleeping, but when water began rising, they woke up and realized they were in danger. Experts believe that at his age, Michael might have understood somewhat about the situation, while Alexander, being too young, only felt fear without understanding what was happening. Neither could unfasten their seatbelts to escape. Shocked public reaction. When news of Susan Smith's confession was announced, all of America felt thunderstruck. Millions of people who had sympathized with this unfortunate mother now felt deceived and outraged. Television networks continuously broadcast news about the case. CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS all dedicated special programs to analyze the case. Images of Susan crying on television during the past 9 days were now replayed with completely different meaning. No longer tears of a grieving mother, but the cruel performance of a killer. African American community response. The African American community, which had already protested Susan's false accusation against an unnamed black man, now felt vindicated, but also extremely angry. Many community leaders spoke out, criticizing Susan for exploiting racial prejudice to cover up her crime. Reverend Jesse Jackson, a famous civil rights leader, stated, "Susan Smith not only killed 2 innocent children, but also tried to kill hope for a just society. She exploited prejudice and fear to blame a non-existent black man. David Smith and a father's pain. David Smith, who had absolutely trusted his ex-wife and defended her against all suspicions, now had to face the cruel truth that the woman he once loved had killed his 2 children." In an interview with ABC's Barbara Walters, David said with a choked voice, "I can't believe Susan could do this. She's the mother of my children. How could she hurt them? I will never forgive her. Never." David also decided to support Susan's execution, even though this meant he had to testify against his former wife. Part 7. Trial of the Century. Trial preparation. The Susan Smith case quickly became one of the most watched trials in American history. Selecting a jury became a major challenge because almost everyone had heard about this case. The prosecution was led by Tommy Pope, a young but talented prosecutor. Pope decided to seek the death penalty for Susan, arguing that her crime was too cruel and unforgivable. The defense was led by Judy Clark and David Brooke, 2 lawyers specializing in death penalty defense. They decided not to argue about the charges, but focused on convincing the jury that Susan needed psychiatric treatment rather than execution. The trial phase. The trial officially began on July 10, 1995, in Union, South Carolina. Unlike the O.J. Simpson case happening at the same time, the Susan Smith trial wasn't allowed to be filmed, but still attracted no less attention. The prosecution presented a clear and convincing case. They proved that Susan had deliberately planned to kill her 2 children to continue her relationship with Tom Findlay. Tom's breakup letter was presented as evidence of motive. One of the trial's most impressive moments was when prosecutors showed a video recreating the scene of the car sinking into the lake. The video showed water slowly flooding into the car, causing many people in the courtroom to cry uncontrollably, including Susan. WAM witness testimony. Tom Findlay testified about his relationship with Susan and his reasons for ending it. His testimony reinforced the motive presented by the prosecution. Beverly Russell, Susan's stepfather, was also called to testify. In an emotional moment, Russell admitted to sexually abusing Susan for many years. He begged the jury to have mercy on Susan and not execute her. The most painful part was David Smith's testimony during the penalty phase. He described his love for his 2 children and the irreplaceable pain of loss. David also expressed support for executing Susan. The verdict. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury declared Susan Smith guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. However, in the penalty phase, they decided not to apply the death penalty, but sentenced her to life in prison with possibility of parole after 30 years. This decision caused major controversy in public opinion. Many people believed Susan deserved execution for her cruel crime. However, some others supported the jury's decision, arguing that executing a woman with a history of sexual abuse wouldn't bring true justice. Part O wide, legacy and meaning. 30 years later. Susan Smith in prison. Susan Smith began serving her sentence at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. Her life in prison has not been peaceful. Due to the particularly cruel nature of her crime, Susan became a target for many other inmates. Over the past 30 years, Susan has repeatedly violated prison rules. She was caught having romantic relationships with at least 2 correctional officers, leading to their dismissal and legal consequences. Susan was also caught using drugs and attempting suicide multiple times. First parole application. In November 2024, exactly 30 years after her conviction, Susan Smith filed her first parole application. The hearing took place at the prison with the South Carolina Parole Board attending. At the hearing, Susan expressed remorse for her actions 30 years ago. She said, "I regret every day what I did. Nothing can excuse my actions. I only hope for the chance to live a meaningful life and help society." However, the parole board denied Susan's application. Reasons given included the cruel nature of the crime, Susan's continuous violation of prison rules, and strong opposition from the victim's family and public opinion. David Smith, now remarried with more children, still firmly opposes releasing Susan. He said, "Susan didn't just kill my 2 children but also destroyed my life. She doesn't deserve freedom." Long-term social impact. The Susan Smith case has left profound impacts on American society. Regarding racial discrimination, Susan's false accusation against a black man highlighted the issue of racial prejudice still existing in American society. The case became a lesson about the danger of making accusations based on prejudice. Regarding media, how the media reported the case during the first 9 days has been analyzed and criticized. Many believe the press trusted Susan's account too much, without thorough verification. Regarding psychology, the case raised major questions about the relationship between childhood psychological trauma and criminal behavior. Many experts have used this case to study the impact of sexual abuse on psychological development. Regarding law, the case influenced how child kidnapping cases are investigated. Police are now trained to thoroughly check relatives' statements before launching large-scale searches. The Susan Smith case isn't just a family tragedy, but also a mirror reflecting the darkest hidden aspects of society. It shows the danger when psychological trauma isn't treated, when racial prejudice still exists, and when media lacks caution in reporting. 30 years have passed since that fateful night at John D. Long Lake, but questions about human nature, the limits of compassion, and how society deals with those who betray trust remain. The story of Michael and Alexander, 2 innocent children who paid with their lives for their mother's selfishness, and twisted ambitions, reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the darkness, but from those we trust most, family and loved ones. It's also a warning about the destructive power of untreated psychological trauma, the price paid when society ignores warning signs, and the danger when we let prejudice and emotions override reason. So what do you think about this case? Does Susan Smith deserve parole after 30 years in prison? Or was her crime too cruel to ever be forgiven? What could have prevented this tragedy if we could turn back time? These aren't just questions about the past, but about the present and future. In today's world, with the pressures of modern life, with the prevalence of depression and psychological issues, how do we protect innocent children from the very people who are supposed to love them most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think society has learned from the Susan Smith case, and have those lessons been effectively applied in practice? Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes of the Case Files, where we explore cases that not only shock with their brutal nature, but also raise profound questions about human nature and society. Because sometimes the most painful truths are the most valuable lessons we can learn. Thank you for following this episode. We'll meet again in other stories about people, about society, and about mysteries still waiting to be solved.